I hesitate, but it looks as though we're ready to start. We've got everyone seated. So, good evening. Welcome to this evening's inaugural lecture by Professor Richard Pettigrew, which I've been asked to say at the outset is a part of the University of Bristol's free public events programme, and it's filled the room. My name is Michael Basker. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts, of which the philosophy department is a very important component. And it's a real privilege to introduce this evening's proceedings. It's good to see so many people here. I don't think I've ever seen this many people sitting in an inaugural lecture, so that's a first and a compliment to Richard before we get going. Lots of familiar faces in the audience, a lot of students as well, which is very good to see, so welcome to them and to colleagues past and present. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to Richard's parents, Maxine and Graham, who've travelled down from Scotland at the weekend to be here with us, and to others of Richard's friends and colleagues who've travelled, in some cases, considerable distances in the bracing spring weather to make it this evening. Inaugural lectures strike me as a slightly arcane university tradition, but they're always at the same time a thoroughly worthwhile and very enjoyable occasion, the purpose of which is to mark the achievement of a colleague in reaching the distinction of becoming a professor at the University of Bristol. These lectures then are first and foremost a celebration of an important landmark in an academic career, the reflection both of a significant international reputation in an intellectual field and of intellectual leadership within and beyond this university. The standard is extremely high, and Richard has achieved this much earlier than most in the Faculty of Arts. The inaugural lecture is also a chance for the new professor to profess, to talk not to the specialists who already know his or her work, but to a wider audience of colleagues and friends and students to explain what it is they do. The brief is to give us an insight into what they excel at, what they work on, what excites and motivates them, why it matters to them, and a sense of why it might interest and inspire and matter to an audience of less initiated, the people who gathered here tonight. We might also expect to be entertained in the process. So no particular pressure, I don't think. It's a challenge, but a rewarding one, an enjoyable one, and typically, as I gather, Richard's not only accepted the challenge of giving the lecture, but he's going to move on towards the end of it to challenge us, the audience, and particularly the academics, and particularly, as I suspect, the academic managers in the audience, in the second part of what he's got to say. So, what of Richard himself? Well, he grew up in East Lothian in Scotland, where he got hooked on philosophy by one of those interdisciplinary coincidences that I like to record, by his teacher of English, who gave him a copy of Sophie's World, a novel which was familiar to very many people in the audience, of course, which weaves a substantial amount of the history of Western philosophy into its novelistic plot, such as it is. Richard went on to read maths and philosophy at Oxford, where he found a group of friends equally perplexed by the mysteries of those pursuits, as well as some fantastic tutors, such as the exceptional Cathy Wilkes, a world-class philosopher of psychology and a humanitarian who showed how an academic can and should contribute to social justice. Richard graduated in 2003 and applied to Bristol to study for an MA in philosophy after reading one of James Ladyman's papers, which apparently was exactly the sort of philosophy that he wanted to do. He then applied for a PhD in the School of Mathematics to work with John Maybury. Richard describes John as being the best supervisor you can imagine, who devoted hours of his time every week, not just to talking about the official topic of Richard's dissertation, but also to chat around Kant and Aristotle and the philosophy of mathematics and even the American Civil War, amongst a whole host of other topics too. The purpose of the thesis was to determine exactly what assumptions were required to provide a foundation for mainstream mathematics. Richard achieved his PhD in this area in 2008 and returned to the philosophy department to take up a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship, intending to spell out the philosophical consequences of the maths that he'd done in his PhD, and also trying to answer another of the fundamental age-old philosophical questions: what are numbers? But he then read a paper by philosopher Jim Joyce about the foundations of statistics and got hooked on this. So during the next 5 years, he was mainly working to extend Joyce's project. In 2011, Richard joined the department as a lecturer, promoted to reader in 2012, and to professor in 2014. This is a meteoric rise, as I've said, which reflects the exceptionally high esteem in which Richard's work is held internationally in several countries across the world. He held an HRC Early Career Fellowship during 2011 to 12. He's currently leading an ARC starting researcher grant project called Epistemic Utility Theory, Foundations and Applications, and also a Leverhulme International Network grant called The Scientific Approach to Methodology. Along with all this, he finds time to run the Department of Philosophy, which is no small feat in itself, I reflect sometimes. And he's found time as well to be a leading light in several major faculty initiatives, including around widening participation, our foundation year, which is something that I think he wants to come on and talk about later in the lecture. So I'll say no more at this point, simply hand over to Richard, whose lecture is called The Art of Thinking.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks very much to you all for coming. So as Mike said, the title is The Art of Thinking. And more precisely, I'd like to talk about the art of thinking well. As we'll see, thinking badly, there's no art to it. We do it well and without any training or talent throughout all of our lives. And I'll talk quite a lot about this in the lecture. Although I'm talking about the art of thinking well, in fact, what a lot of the things that I'll be talking about will be how we fail to do this in a number of ways, to show how we've in fact failed to master the art of thinking and how that can have an impact on all sorts of decisions that we make and all sorts of issues to do with social justice. But I thought I'd first of all say a little bit about why you might be interested in thinking well. Why thinking well is something important for us to theorize about as philosophers or thinkers. And I thought I'd just give a couple of examples, just hopefully slightly representative examples from different parts of the history of philosophy, which are supposed to illustrate things that certain philosophers think thinking well is useful for. So I'm going to start off with Epicurus. So for Epicurus, you'll maybe have heard of Epicurus. He's a couple of generations after Aristotle, an Athenian philosopher, a couple of generations after Aristotle. And for Epicurus, you may have heard of the term Epicurean, and Epicurus gives his name to that. For Epicurus, the sole goal of life, or the main goal of life, the thing that makes a life go well, is what he called ataraxia. And ataraxia is a sort of freedom from certain sorts of anxiety. And Epicurus also thought that the main source of the anxieties that haunt our lives and that prevent us from fulfilling this particular goal that he talks about is our fear of death, an anxiety based on our fear of death. And Epicurus thought that you could argue people out of their fear of death. He thought that you could remove this anxiety and thus give people more of a chance of fulfilling the central goal of their life by arguing them out of their fear of death. So for Epicurus, one of the key roles of thinking well, thinking rationally, using your faculty of reason well, was to remove the fear of death, remove the anxiety caused by the fear of death, and thereby live a good life. So here's Epicurus' argument. I won't go into much detail. I'm really trying to just give a flavor for what particular philosophers have thought is the purpose of thinking about thinking well. But here's Epicurus' argument in his letter to Menicius. Accustom yourself, he says, to believe that death is nothing to us. For good and evil imply awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness. Death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us. Seeing that when we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not. It is nothing then either to the living or to the dead, for with the living it is not, and the dead exist no longer. And the details of this argument aren't particularly important, and whether or not you think it's a good argument is something that's been debated on and off for the last 2,000 years. But the argument's supposed to show that there can't be anything bad about death. It's supposed to make us aware of the fact that our fear of death, which is supposed to be based on the alleged badness of death for the person who dies, is irrational because death itself can't be bad. If something's going to be bad, then it's got to be bad for a person at a particular time. And death, according to Epicurus, is a badness that can't happen to a person at a particular time. It can't happen to a person when they're alive, because at that point they're not dead. But it similarly can't happen to them when they're dead, because by that point they no longer exist and therefore can't be the subject of any sort of badness. So Epicurus thought that this sort of argument, again, it's an argument that you might take issue with and that you might try to make responses to and engage with, but this sort of argument, he thought, could serve the purpose of removing from you the very anxiety that scuppers your chance of living the most fulfilled life, a life of ataraxia, a life free from those sorts of anxieties. A whistle-stop tour through history of philosophy. This is, we're going to move forward 1800 years to René Descartes, writing at the beginning of what came to be called the Age of Reason, the period that led into the Enlightenment. For René Descartes, the purpose of thinking well, the purpose of using your reason, your faculty of reason as well as possible, the purpose of thinking rationally, was to see off two problematic ways of thinking. One of them was beliefs that were formed entirely on the basis of superstition. The other one was beliefs formed on the basis of authority. So two ways in which you might have certain sorts of beliefs: superstition and prejudice, and on the other hand, beliefs that you gain just because you've listened to someone in a position of authority and they've told you this belief. And Descartes thought that this was problematic for our thinking. Our thinking wasn't, our beliefs weren't founded on good argument if we just trusted to authority or to prejudice or superstition. So here's Descartes. Some years ago, he said, I was struck by how many false things I had believed and by how doubtful was the structure of beliefs I had based on them. I realized if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last, I needed just once in my life to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations. I'm here quite alone, and at last I will devote myself sincerely and without holding back to demolishing my opinions. And this begins Descartes' sort of great work in philosophy, the Meditations on First Philosophy. And what he attempts to do there is, as he says, demolish all of his opinions and begin from the start, from a clean slate, to build back up beliefs, each one of them being subjected to rational scrutiny, and therefore each one of them built on a more solid foundation and not vulnerable to the sort of problems that he identified, the problems of forming your beliefs just on the basis of what people in authority, in Descartes' time quite often the church, or your parents, or the societal norms that surround you, forming your beliefs just on the basis of those things, or on the basis of superstition and prejudice. So for Descartes, thinking well, thinking rationally, honing your faculty of reason is liberating. It's a sort of liberating influence. It emancipates you from the hold that the dictates of authority or the societal norms or your prejudices or superstitions have on you. And this was a theme that would run throughout the Age of Reason. Fast forwarding again, slightly less time this time, another 400 or so years, to right up to the current day, we have the Princeton philosopher Elizabeth Harman. Now, Harman's general area of expertise is in the area of the ethics of creating life, the ethics of reproduction, for instance, and other and creating life, ethical issues that arise from this. But one part of Harman's work has been identifying certain ways of thinking, certain sorts of reasoning that we use when we're trying to make decisions, perhaps decisions, reproductive decisions about having a child, but also other sorts of major life decisions, identifying certain sorts of reasoning that we use in these cases, which is flawed in some way. That's what she's been interested in. And the particular sort of reasoning that I'm going to just briefly mention now, she calls "I'll be glad I did it" reasoning. Okay, and the reason for the name becomes obvious in a second. So here's a particular example of it. I'm sitting in my flat and I've got two choices ahead of me. I could either stay in my flat and watch some television, slob on the sofa and eat cheese on toast, or I could go to the gym. And I reason as follows about what I'm going to do. I say, if I go to the gym, I'll be glad that I did that. Okay, so then I should go to the gym. And that initially strikes you as pretty good sort of reasoning, or that sort of reasoning is the sort of thing at least people that do quite a lot of the time and people don't take exception to. You think about a particular decision you're making now on the basis of whether your future self, after you've made the decision, will ratify that earlier decision and think it was the right thing to do. Okay. But, as Harman points out, this isn't always good reasoning. Here, consider the following situation. I'm making a slightly larger life decision than the one I just described. I'm deciding on my future career, and the two options before me are I become an arms trader or I become an academic philosopher. And this isn't autobiographical. And I've been doing a lot of research into this, so I've read a whole bunch of articles, interviews with arms traders. And it turns out that all of them, whichever starting point they come from, come later on to really value the life that they lead. They value the connections with the mighty and powerful that they form, and they value the enormous remuneration that they enjoy. And so regardless of where they start off from, they end up at the end of it being glad that they made that particular decision. So I can reasonably say to myself, well, if I become an arms trader, rather than an academic philosopher, I'll be glad I did it. My future self, after I've made that decision, after I've lived a few years with that decision, will ratify the earlier decision. Therefore, I decide to become an arms trader. There's clearly bad reasoning. Okay? That particular example of this style of reasoning, this form of reasoning, shows that the reasoning in general is bad. And what Harman wants to point out is that although both of these examples, in some sense, are not really particularly realistic or don't seem particularly deep, there are decisions that people make exactly on the basis of this sort of reasoning that are very important. So she has some rather controversial examples to do with when one decides to have a child and the circumstances in which one decides to have a child. And I don't want to talk about these here, but I just wanted to draw attention to another way in which reasoning well, thinking rationally, can be thought to be important by philosophers. So that's supposed to just give a little hint of some of the ways, 3 examples out of a subject with a long history, but 3 examples of ways in which thinking well has been important in philosophy. Okay, so part of what I wanted to try to do there is give you the sense that thinking well is an important thing to do. It's not just something that would be quite good for us to do. It's quite good for us to do, and it's important that we do it well. These are major decisions that we have to make. For Epicurus, it's the very living of a good life that's at stake in whether you can reason well or not. For Descartes, it's whether or not you live a life with beliefs that are simply handed down to you by either superstition or authority, or whether you live a life with beliefs that are built up on the basis of your own reasoning. For Harman, it's making major life decisions on the basis of good practical reasoning or not. So reasoning well is very important. So it turns out it's a shame that we do it so badly. Now, it's no surprise, it's a sort of commonplace to learn that people don't reason well in their life. This is not a great revelation to you, that people don't reason well. We all have friends, colleagues, family who seem to make major mistakes in reasoning all the time, and deciding how they're going to act, or in arguments that you have with them, and debates you have with them, and so on. So it's not surprising to learn that people don't reason very well. What's more surprising to learn, and what became to be documented through the latter half of the 20th century, is how humans systematically reason badly in very general ways. That there are very general sorts of fallacy that humans commit in all different areas of their reasoning. And this is a little bit unfair, but to just give us a little bit of a sense, the 2 of the psychologists who were at the forefront of identifying these particular systematic ways in which people reason badly were Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And I'm going to describe a little bit of a couple of the instances of bad reasoning that were identified around this time. The first one particularly is due to Kahneman and Tversky, and the second one's because it's a particularly interesting case. Kahneman, people may have heard of recently, as he has a popular book out called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a sort of summary of all of the work that he did from the 60s up to the present day on these issues. Okay, so here's the first situation, and we're going to come back to this case a couple of times, okay? Because I first of all want to present the case, and then I want to say a little bit about what's wrong with it, and then later on I want to try to identify why, in fact, causally, people do reason badly in this case. Okay, so here's the example. I'm going to just give you a little bit of biography about a person called Jane. And then I'm going to ask you which of two statements you think is more likely. So here's the little bit of biography. When she was a student, Jane was a member of the CND. She was a student a while back. She was a member of the CND and the Green Party, and she volunteered at the Migrants' Rights Centre in Bristol. This wasn't the original Kahneman-Tversky example. But that's a little bit of biography. And then they give two statements about Jane, two claims about her. Jane is an accountant and a political activist, that's number one. And number two, Jane's an accountant. And they ask subjects of this test, which of those do you think is more likely? So a quick pop quiz, who thinks one is more likely than two? Don't be shy. Okay. So some people, and who thinks two is more likely or at least as likely as one? Well, a few more. Okay, so a slightly atypical audience here. So there's always a risk with these things. So it turns out most subjects say that one is more likely than two, which is problematic because that can't possibly be the case. It can't possibly be the case that that first statement is more likely than the second one. Why? Because the first statement, in fact, entails the second one. All the situations in which the first one's true are also situations in which the second one's true. So the set of possibilities in which the first one's true is in fact included in the set of possibilities in which the second one's true. And so you should think the first one can't be more likely than the second one. Okay, we're going to come back to that. So I'm not just leaving it completely now. We're going to come back to this a couple of times. This is called the conjunction fallacy. It's a conjunction fallacy because the first statement is a conjunction. That's two statements conjoined together. And the second statement is one of the conjuncts, one of the statements that gets conjoined. And the point is that it's irrational ever to think it more likely that a conjunction's true than one of its conjuncts. This gets called the conjunction fallacy. It was identified by Kahneman and Tversky. Okay, that's the first problem. Second problem is, one interesting feature of this, one thing to sort of note about that, was that it's quite easy for me to convince you that there was something going wrong with the reasoning there. I mean, in fact, quite a lot of people didn't do the reasoning incorrectly. But for those who did, it's quite easy to explain why, in fact, it was the wrong thing to say. And sort of overcome that particular piece of irrationality. Turns out it's much more difficult in this case, and I'll try to do it, but if history is anything to go by, then it probably won't work. So this is Marilyn Vos Savant. Marilyn Vos Savant was in the Guinness Book of Records during the late 90s for having the highest IQ in the world. And as a result, Parade magazine in the US asked her to write a column, the Ask Marilyn column. And she wrote this in which she summarized logical problems, mathematical brain teasers, that sort of thing, and then explained what the solution was to them. And one of the problems, the one that made her most famous, was the Monty Hall puzzle. And I'm going to describe this. It was named after the presenter of a 60s game show called Let's Make a Deal, Monty Hall. And because the puzzle is basically based around a situation that's a little bit like the Make a Deal game show. So here's the situation as a contestant on this game show. You come onto the stage and you're presented with 3 doors. Behind one of those doors is a luxury car, a sort of very posh sports car or something like that. Behind the other 2 doors are goats. And you're asked to assume that you prefer the luxury sports car to the goat. So you want to win the luxury sports car. Okay, but you don't know where the sports car resides. Either resides behind door 3 or door 2 or door 1, but you don't get to see that. All you get to see are the doors. So Monty opens the show. This is Monty. Monty opens the show by asking you to pick a door. Okay, you've got to pick door 1, 2, or 3. You pick a door, and then he tells you, once you've picked a door, I'm going to open another of the doors, and when I open that other door, it will be to reveal a goat. Okay. And you know that he can do this because there are two goats. So even if you're standing in front of one of them, there will be another door that he can open to reveal the other goat. So he'll always be able to do that. But he tells you that he'll open one of the other doors in order to reveal a goat. He definitely won't open a door in order to reveal the sports car. Okay, so you pick your door. Let's say you pick door 1. The puzzle works regardless of which one you pick. And Monty then opens door 2 to reveal a goat. And he now offers you a switch, okay? You can do one of two things. You can stick where you are, standing in front of door 1, or you can switch and go and stand in front of door number 3, the other one that hasn't been opened. And you're going to win whatever's behind the door that you're standing in front of. And the question is, should you stick or should you switch? Or does it really matter which you decide to do? Now, Vos Savant said, you should always switch in that situation. She thinks you're twice as likely to get the car if you switch to door 3 rather than sticking with door 1. If you stick with door 1, you're half as likely to get the car, which is the thing your heart's set on. Okay, so she published this in the magazine, and there was the most astonishing response to it. 10,000 letters were written to the magazine, 1,000 of them by people very explicitly stating that they held PhDs in mathematics, explaining that she was incorrect and had basically committed a basic fallacy of mathematical reasoning. One of the most famous people who called her to account on this or claimed that she had got it wrong was a mathematician called Paul Erdős, one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century, partly for how many papers he wrote and also for how many collaborators he had, but a really highly esteemed mathematician. Erdős and these 10,000 people, 1,000 of them boasting of their PhDs, said it doesn't matter whether you switch. It's half chance either way. You've revealed the goat, and now there's either a goat behind you or a car behind you. You have the information symmetric, so it's half-half. It turns out Vos Savant was right, but it took an enormous amount of time to convince people. And in fact, in the case of Erdős and a number of these people, they were only convinced by a computer simulation, which essentially reran the Monty Hall problem hundreds of times and showed that in the long run, it did turn out to be the case that twice as often the car was behind the other door that you weren't standing in front of. Okay, let me just try. So I'm sort of assuming to some extent that people are with Erdős and think that it's sort of half-half. But I'm going to try to explain why it's in fact why Vos Savant was right. So here are the three situations, the three possible situations. Here's the three doors, 1, 2, and 3, and here are the three possible configurations. The car could be behind door 3 or door 2 or door 1. And you know at the beginning of the whole setup, once you've chosen door 1, that it's equal chance for each of them, a third chance for each of them. Okay. But of course, and here's the really crucial part of the puzzle, those aren't just the three possibilities. Each one of those possibilities has sub-possibilities as well. And those sub-possibilities are specified by which of the doors Monty chooses to open. Okay? So you could be in this first situation where the car is behind door 3. You've chosen door 1. Monty opens door 2, or you could open door 3. Similarly for the second situation, similarly for the third situation. Now, But we know certain things about the setup of the problem that allows us to assign probabilities to each of these now 6 possibilities. For instance, in the first one, we know that the specification of the problem is such that Monty has to open door 2 because he's obliged to open one with a goat behind it. You're standing in front of the other one with the goat, so he's got to open door 2. So all the probability from this one gets put onto the door 2 option. There's no chance at all that he opens door 3 because that's the one with the car. Similarly, in the second situation, his hand's forced again. He has to open door 3, so all the probability from this one gets put onto door 3, none of it gets onto door 2. The crucial point is, in the situation in which you're standing in front of the car, Monty's got an open choice, and he's going to flip a coin to figure out which one he does. So the probability that was originally assigned to this gets distributed equally between those two. Half of the chances he's going to open door 2, and the other half he's going to open door 3. Okay, so here, those are the probabilities. And now he's going to actually do it. And what we learn is Monty opens door 2. So what does that do? Well, it rules out all of the possibilities, all of the 3 of the 6 possibilities in which Monty opens door 3. Okay? So this possibility, and this possibility. And what remain are these possibilities. So what you know for certain, what you learn for certain, is that it's definitely not this situation. That gets 0 probability. But what's important, and what it is that shows that Vos Savant is right, is that the probability of this is twice the probability of that. Okay? So the probability that the car is in fact behind door 3 is twice the probability that it's behind door 1. And so you're going to be twice as likely to get the car if you switch from standing in front, where you are standing in front of door 1, standing in front of door 3. Now, there's a kind of interesting story behind the Monty Hall problem. You've got the story about Erdős getting it wrong and so on, and people tend to get it wrong when they're first presented with it. But there's a sort of deep fact about statistical inference that you learn by looking at the Monty Hall problem. Basically, what goes wrong in the Monty Hall problem, the reason that people get this wrong, is they think that all you learn when he opens the second door is that there is a goat behind door 2. But in fact, you learn something more. You learn there's a goat behind door 2, and you also learn that Monty chose to open door 2 in order to reveal it to you. If all that you had learned was that there was a goat behind door 2, if, for instance, your friend was there and sort of peeked behind and just shouted, "There's a goat behind door 2, then you would be right. It would be half and half. But the setup of the problem is such that you learn something more. You learn, moreover, that Monty opened door 2 in order to reveal it to you. And the setup of the problem, which this is what this reveals, means that you're twice as likely to get the car by switching. Okay, so that's just meant to be a bit of an introduction to the ways in which we're irrational when we, in our reasoning. And what's particularly interesting about the second case is that it's not just straightforward to draw attention to people's irrationality in the Monty Hall problem, and then they just immediately see it. In fact, it takes quite a lot of reasoning. It took Vos Savant writing in her column basically for 10 weeks after the original article in order to convince most of her detractors that she was, in fact, correct. Okay, so that's the Monty Hall problem and the conjunction fallacy. I want to just quickly say something now about the conjunction fallacy, because in both of these cases, I've presented a certain way in which we reason badly, and then I've tried to convince you that, in fact, the reasoning that we've come to, the conclusion we've come to, is the wrong one. And when I've done that, I've really been appealing to quite general facts about good reasoning. For instance, in the case of the conjunction fallacy, I've said, well, if you've got a set of possibilities and then some larger set of possibilities, the larger set of possibilities should get the greater probability. But that's a very general principle about probabilities and good reasoning. Similarly, in the Monty Hall case, I've made a lot of assumptions about how probability gets distributed from one option onto another option and so on. So these are general questions about, general principles of statistical inference, essentially, that are used when we're trying to convince people that they've reasoned well or they've reasoned badly. But of course, as philosophers, one of our main aims is to put those sorts of principles, those sorts of assumptions that are the basis and foundation for certain sorts of reasoning, say in science or in everyday life, put those principles under the microscope and scrutinize them to see whether they're correct or not. So I want to give a little hint about some of the work that I do on the basis for these sorts of principles, because essentially my research over the last 5 years has been exactly on this question. How do you justify, how do you ground, how do you provide a foundation for good principles of statistical reasoning? So we're not going to get very far with it. We're only going to get a very, very basic one, but it should give some sense of how this sort of justification is supposed to go. So return to the conjunction fallacy. I mean, we're really just going to be interested in the two claims now. Jane's an accountant, a political activist, and Jane is an accountant. How might we try to justify the principle that says that you should have at least as great a probability in this as you have in this one? Okay, here's an attempt. Let's take someone, a particular person who violates this, someone who commits the conjunction fallacy, one of the typical people on the Kahneman and Tversky participation test. So maybe these are the strengths of belief that the person has. They have 80% confidence in the first one and 50% confidence in the second one. So they've committed the fallacy. They've got a stronger belief in the conjunction than they have in the conjunct. And here's the style of reasoning here. What we want to show is this. The first part of the reasoning goes as follows. There's a particular aim that rational thinking has. There's a particular end goal that we're trying to achieve when we reason, when we use principles of rationality in order to form our beliefs. There's some way we would ideally like to be. And here's my claim about the way we would like to be. We'd like to be in a situation where we had the strongest possible confidence in everything that was true and the lowest possible confidence in everything that was false. Okay? So that's the sort of end of inquiry. That's how I would like to be at the end of inquiry. I'd essentially like to be an omniscient being. I'd like to be a being that knew everything, who had 100% confidence in everything that was true and 0% confidence in everything that was false. Okay, so here are the ideal confidences that we would have. Suppose the ideal confidences to have will change depending on how the world is. Okay, so here's one way the world could be. Suppose Jane is an accountant and she's an activist, so both of these claims are true. Well, in that case, the ideal person will have 100% confidence in both of the claims. In the second case, suppose Jane's an accountant, but she's not an activist, so the first one's false, but the second one's true. Then you'll have 0% confidence in the first one and 100% in the second one. And finally, suppose she's not an accountant at all, then you should have 0% confidence in both of them. So those would be the ideals. I'm not claiming that anyone really should have one of those, but that's what ultimately we would be aiming for. That's why we're doing rational inquiry, is to try to get as close to that ideal as possible. And what I want to show, and the PowerPoint slides aren't perfect, what I want to show is that by having the degrees of belief that she has, by having the levels of confidence that she has when she commits the conjunction fallacy, our agent, our person who has these, is irrational because there's some other confidences that she could have, some other degrees of confidence she could have that would do better, that would get closer to the ideal of inquiry, the ideal end goal of inquiry than she currently has. Okay, so this slide was not supposed to all appear at once, but I can talk through it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to plot the confidences that we have in these two claims. Jane is an accountant and a political activist, and Jane's an accountant. We're going to plot those on this square. Okay, so how far our point is along, from left to right, will be determined by how confident the person is in this claim that Jane's an accountant, and how far it is up the vertical axis of the square will be determined by how confident she is in the claim that Jane's an accountant and an activist. Okay, so suppose we're in the situation where they're both false. Okay, so Jane's not an accountant, they're both false. Then the ideal, the perfect person, the person we would most like to be like, is going to have these degrees of confidence, 0 in both of them. If, on the other hand, this one's true and this one's false, she'll have 0 in this and 100% in that. And then finally, if they're both true, the ideal is to have 100% in both of them. Okay. Now look at this, this slightly darker blue triangle. That consists of all the degrees of confidence you could have. All the different points in that correspond to a degree of confidence you have where you don't commit the conjunction fallacy, because you have at least as much confidence in this proposition as you do in this one. Okay, that's the setup. Now suppose you lie outside this blue triangle. So this means you commit the conjunction fallacy. You have greater confidence in this claim than you have in this claim. Then look, we can find another set of confidences that you could have had, these ones here. And this point here is going to be closer to each of the ideal points than this one is. Okay? So the point is, what's irrational about the person who lies out here is that there's something else they could have done, other degrees of confidence they could have had, such that however the world turns out, it's going to turn out to be that this other person would have been closer to the ideal of inquiry, the ideal end of inquiry, the sort of omniscient degrees of confidence than you would be. And that seems to rule you out as irrational. So this research project is essentially takes a particular story about what the ideal end of inquiry is, and then tries to justify statistical principles of inference by showing that in order to get close, or as close as possible, as close as you might wish to get, to the ideal end of inquiry, you had better satisfy these principles of statistical inference. So the principles that says you should never have higher confidence in a claim like this, a conjunction, than in one of its conjuncts. That claim, which is a sort of very basic, extremely basic principle of statistical inference, can be justified by showing that if you violate it, then you'll be guaranteed to be further from the end of inquiry than you need to be. Okay. So I wanted to talk at the beginning of the lecture about some of my research, and this brings us up to that point. But I take inaugurals to be, in some ways, an introduction of a member of staff to their colleagues and members of the public and the students. And the purpose is to talk a little bit about all aspects of your work and not just the research work. So I wanted to do in the remainder of the lecture is to talk a little bit about other aspects of the work that I think is important at the university. And one of these is to do with representation of certain groups of people in the university in various capacities. One group I'm particularly interested in is the academic staff. What's the composition of the academic staff? Who's represented there? Who gets to participate as an academic, not just in as an academic member of staff in this university, but in universities throughout the country? I'm also going to be interested in the makeup of the student body, representation of different groups of people, underrepresented groups within our student body. So I'd like to talk about those separately. Okay, so let's begin with underrepresented groups amongst the academic staff. And this is, all of my thinking about this and the sort of work that I've been doing on it has been done really in conjunction with Javi Carrell in the philosophy department and Julia Terzian in the philosophy department. So here is a depressing set of statistics. These are HESA statistics about the representation of 3 groups within permanent academic staff in the UK. And the numbers are no better in the US or other Anglophone countries. So the number of women with, the proportion of the people with a permanent academic position who are women in the UK is 38%, whereas it's roughly 50% in the general population. The proportion of people with permanent academic jobs who are black in the UK is 1%, whereas in the general population it's 3.5%. For disabled people, it's 3% in academia and 18% in the general population. Now, academia, and particularly universities that belong to a group like the Russell Group, which is supposed to be a lobby group that consists of some of the most prestigious universities in the UK, universities like that are gatekeepers to an enormous range of privilege. This is sort of clear from for the people who come to study with us as undergraduate students and postgraduate students. The privilege that having a degree from a university like Bristol or Russell Group University confers on you is enormous. The sort of doors that it opens are obvious. But similarly, a great deal of privilege is conferred upon someone when they become a member of academic staff in one of these institutions. Not only are these sort of high, well-respected jobs, but they also allow people to be involved in an academic conversation which can inform all aspects of policy making, and so on. So it's incredibly important that we ensure that the principles by which, and the admissions procedures and the hiring procedures by which people come to participate in universities and higher education are as fair as possible. And statistics like this suggest that, in fact, they're not. So what can we do about it, and what's causing the problem? That's the first thing I would like to talk a little bit about with respect to the academic staff. And I want to talk about it I want to talk about a particular hypothesis about one of the factors that's feeding into this problem. I don't make any claim that this is the sole factor that's feeding into it, or perhaps even the largest factor. But I want to talk about it for two reasons. One of them is that it relates to this talk of thinking rationally or thinking well. One of the sources, I think, of the underrepresentation that those statistics show is bad thinking or irrational thinking on the part of the people making decisions. Perhaps, as we'll see, not blameworthy irrational thinking, but nonetheless irrational thinking, and irrational thinking that we can perhaps try to change. So one reason I want to talk about this is that it relates to the general topic of the lecture. This is to do with thinking well and the sorts of effects that failing to think well can have. But another reason I want to talk about it is that this is, if it's correct that this is one of the factors that's feeding it, there's quite a lot that you can do about it. Okay, so as I said, we're coming back to the conjunction fallacy quite a lot in the lecture. Here I'd like to talk a little bit about what people have thought is the mechanism by which we commit the conjunction fallacy. In some ways, the conjunction fallacy is the simplest fallacy that we commit. And so it's surprising that we do it at all. It's very easy to reason someone out of it once they've committed it. So why do we do it at all? And here's what I take to be the best explanation. Again, it's given by Daniel Kahneman and his co-authors, who I mentioned before. The thought is this. What happens when you're asked a question like, how likely is it that a person belongs to a particular group? For instance, how likely is it that Jane belongs to the group of accountants or the group of people who are accountants and political activists? It turns out that's quite a difficult question for your brain to answer. It requires quite a lot of cognitive work. And so what the brain does instead is it substitutes in an easier question in its place. An easier question that it thinks will typically and on average get roughly the same answer as the more difficult question. So there won't really be much loss in answering the easier question rather than the more difficult question. And here is the question that Kahneman at least thinks the brain substitutes in place of this sort of question. So when I ask you, how likely is Jane to be a member of some particular group? What your brain substitutes in instead is how similar is Jane to the prototype of that group. So the idea is that to each group or to many groups that we're interested in, groups of people, we associate a prototype, a particular exemplar that's supposed to be representative of the group. And when someone asks you, how likely is it that this particular person in front of you is a member of that group, what your brain answers instead is how similar is that person in front of you to the prototype for that group. So you can see how that's going to work in the case of Jane and the conjunction fallacy. When I ask you, how likely is it that she's a member, how likely is it that she's an accountant and a political activist, you ask how close she is to your prototype for that group. And she's pretty close. She was a member of the CND, she was in the Green Party, and so on. Whereas if I ask you, how close is she to the, how likely is it that she's an accountant, you ask, how close is she to your typical accountant? And then you might think she isn't particularly close to your typical accountant, so you think that's less likely. So this is how this is supposed to explain the conjunction fallacy, but it also explains the sort of, well, doesn't fully explain, but might be part of the explanation for some of the underrepresentation of the groups that we were looking at earlier, women and certain minorities in academia. Because suppose you're hiring a particular person, and so you're essentially assessing their work for the quality of the work, in order to make your hiring decision. Then really what you're being asked for is how likely is this person to be successful at this particular endeavor? How good is this person at this endeavor? But what your brain substitutes instead, in place of that, and what it answers instead, is how close, how similar is this particular person to the prototype of someone who is successful at this endeavor. Now, if you want to know what a prototypical philosopher is, who the prototype might be for a philosopher, a few depressing moments on Google Images will reveal a series of pages, all of which show pictures of middle-aged white men. So, and in some sense for good reason, the sort of statistics I brought up before showed that those are in fact the prevalent people, the majority in academia, those statistics were for, but they're reflected very much, and in fact in a lot of ways worse, in philosophy. So That people have this particular prototype for a group is not too surprising and is based to some extent on their evidence from the world. But nonetheless, it means that when you make a judgment, when I'm in a hiring situation, or one of our colleagues is in a hiring situation trying to decide who to appoint next in the philosophy department, or who should get promoted in the philosophy department, or I'm writing a letter of recommendation for somebody, or we've got to decide whether to appoint someone to a committee on a learned society, or to give a keynote address at an important conference. Instead of asking how good is that person at this particular task, you ask how close are they to the particular prototype for the class of successful people in this area. And that prototype has all the characteristics that are well represented and none of the characteristics that are underrepresented in philosophy. So the famous example of this, the famous instance of this experiment that sort of brought this to people's attention and is explained by this hypothesis is the following famous study. So about 240 academic psychologists, half of them male, half of them female, evaluated a CV that was randomly assigned a male name or a female name. So it was an identical CV other than the name at the top of it. And half of the CVs had male name, half of them had female name, and they were distributed amongst these academic psychologists. And both male and female participants in this study were twice as likely to hire the applicant that they associated with the male name as with the female name. This experiment's been rerun where the names are typically white names and typically Arab names recently, and the similar sorts of things were revealed. So this is supposed to be a hypothesis about one of the causes of underrepresentation in academia. One of the nice features of it, it's an incredibly depressing story, up until the point where you realize that, in fact, there's quite a lot you can do to mitigate the effects of this. So this is called implicit bias, this phenomenon of us picking people not on the basis of evaluating the quality of their work, but basically evaluating them on the basis of how close they are to the typical person. There's quite a lot you can do to mitigate this. Anonymizing is sort of clear and a crude but very effective way to do it. You can't anonymize everything. But there are certain interventions you can make whenever you have to make a decision about these sort of things that will help. For instance, reflecting on a time when you were biased in the past will work. Reflecting on a time when you weren't biased, it turns out, won't help, but will make things worse. So you've got to be careful with these interventions. But there's quite a lot that you can do. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. And there's quite a lot more information about this, if you're interested in this. There's quite a lot more information about this at our philosophy pages, where we talk about implicit bias and ways of counteracting it. The other thing I wanted to talk about was underrepresentation amongst the student population. And in neither of these cases am I focusing on Bristol, I should say. The problems that I'm talking about pervade throughout the universities in the UK. Certainly the problems with the academic staff pervade throughout all universities. The problems that I'm now going to talk about are much more prevalent in the Russell Group universities, but that are seen elsewhere in the universities as well. Okay. And like I said, the important thing here is not just to sort of look at the interesting psychological evidence, but to see that the bad ways of thinking that are being revealed by this psychological evidence are having effects that result in a sort of social injustice. People are being excluded from academic conversations, being excluded from certain sorts of jobs because of our bad thinking, because of the bad ways that we think. Okay, a similar story happens, a similar story can be told about our undergraduate population. Now, it turns out that rather different groups are underrepresented here. For instance, women are not underrepresented, at least not in philosophy, though in other subjects there are issues about that. But if we look at this, in many elite universities, many of the Russell Group universities, only 60% of entrants, people who come into the undergraduate courses, come from state school, whereas 82% of post-16 pupils attend these schools. Similar story, or in fact a much worse story, if you look at people from particular parts of the socioeconomic classification, namely groups 4 to 7, which are classified in terms of jobs that are typically associated with lower incomes. Many elite universities have only around 12% of their entrants coming from these groups, whereas 46% of post-16 pupils belong to them. And mature students, another area where numbers are reduced, has seen a 7% reduction recently in the numbers. What's the cause of this problem, and what are we going to do about it? Here's the official response. This is Wendy Pyatt, the Director General of the Russell Group. The main reason pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to go to leading universities because they're not achieving the right grades. It is also the case that some very bright students are not encouraged to apply for leading universities. We cannot offer them places for those who do not apply or who have not done the right subjects to study their chosen course. Acts as an issue for leading universities across the globe. There's no silver bullet. School attainment, advice, and aspirations must all be dramatically improved if we are to tackle the real barriers to fair access. The solution, therefore, is not with the universities, according to the Russell Group. The problem lies entirely with the schools, and the universities are doing what they can to try to mitigate this, but the schools essentially are to blame. This is, to my mind, an unacceptably passive view by the Russell Group. We wouldn't accept this sort of excuse from schools. So schools could tell a similar story about the attainment gap. So there are attainment gaps for people from particular backgrounds in schools. But it wouldn't be acceptable if the schools were to come back to us and say, well, look, that's really just the responsibility of the parents. This is all just correlates with the extent to which parents support their children's engagement with education and the aspirations that the parents have for the pupils. We wouldn't accept that as an answer. We wouldn't accept that as a solution. Schools we would require to be an equal partner in solving the problem. Now, of course, in fact, the universities do a lot. There's a huge outreach program in this university. There's a large widening participation office, and it does a lot of exceptionally good work, reaching post-16 pupils from a whole range of different schools. But I think it's fair to say that it's only part of the solution to this problem. And what I want to just finish off by talking about is an alternative, well, not an alternative, but another part of what I think is the solution to this sort of problem. And this is the foundation year in arts and humanities. It's a program that I designed together with Tom Sperlinger from the English department, and that was then run by me and Tom and Josie McClellan from the history department for its first year, and then this year by Tom and Josie and Vanda Zyko from classics. And Vanda also oversaw the project, Project Arts, which was an initiative that the foundation year came out of. And the foundation year is a one-year pre-undergraduate program, so it's meant to lead into undergraduate study. It takes 30 students every year, and its two really characteristic features are, first of all, that if you complete the year satisfactorily, you can choose to leave and you get an exit qualification. But if you wish to progress, you're guaranteed progression onto an undergraduate program in the Faculty of Arts. The second crucial feature of it is that no formal qualifications are required. So application is by an application form with a personal statement. We then sometimes follow up and ask for written work, and that's then explored in an interview, and admission is based on the interview. The program is meant to be comprehensive across the Faculty of Arts. Each week, a different lecturer from a different discipline will come in and give lectures to the students on a topic from their particular discipline, but then in the afternoons, the seminars, which are run by the same person each week, explore that topic so that we have the range of diversity in teaching, but also the cohesion that comes from having the same seminar tutor each week. And alongside that, study skills are woven into the teaching as well. So each aspect of the course was designed specifically to try to address a group that would not, for whom the standard routes into higher education were not available, who wouldn't be reached even by the outreach work that the universities standardly do. And these groups are many and are often invisible to thinking about widening participation within a university. Groups like people who have no qualifications because they suffered bereavement during the time when they would have taken their school qualifications, or their homes were disrupted in various ways, or they became addicted to drugs or spent time in prison, or suffered long-term mental health problems. Sorts of people who, for whatever reason, don't have the sort of qualifications or don't have them near to the level required in order to come onto a course in something like a Russell Group university, however much we tweak the admissions criteria, but nonetheless who would benefit from and who would thrive on an undergraduate course. So the foundation year was designed really to reach that sort of demographic, a demographic that otherwise can be invisible to the university. And of course, once you've set up a course like that, it's all very well to have it, but if it's not used, if it's not, if you don't get people onto it, then it doesn't serve its purpose. So another feature of it was to run tasters, to run advertising taster courses with local community organizations like the Ideal Project in Barton Hill, who work with people with problems with addiction and long-term unemployment, the Single Parent Action Network in Easton that works with one-parent families living in poverty and isolation, Refugee Women of Bristol, an organization that works to enhance the educational status of refugee women living in the city. So as well as having this purpose to try to create an alternative route into higher education for people from backgrounds who would otherwise be excluded from it, the Foundation Year also sought to create links with parts of the city that might be invisible to the university and its work. So thinking well is important for all sorts of aspects of what we do. And thinking badly, not doing it well, not having mastered the art of thinking, can have profound societal effects. The sort of bad statistical inference that we saw examples of early on, although we weren't looking at examples of it where it goes badly wrong, can give rise to all sorts of societal problems. The sort of thinking badly that gave rise to the bias that led to people being underrepresented systematically within the academic community, another bad societal effect. And also, the way that we think about widening participation, the way that we think about getting people into our university to teach them, can also be affected by that sort of biased thinking. When we think about who we will try to reach with our widening participation initiatives, who we'll try to reach when we try to engage other groups in the university, it's often tempting to look to those groups who aren't represented, but who are closest to those who are well represented, because of the sorts of phenomena that I was talking about later, to do with trying to identifying people who are as close to a prototype as possible. So hopefully that gives some sense of the importance of thinking well and the importance of mastering the art of thinking, not just for good epistemic hygiene, not just for having a nice set of beliefs that is likely to match up with the world, but because it has societal impacts as well. Thanks very much.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for a tremendous, fascinating lecture that lived up to the billing, and much more, I think, as well. The applause was richly deserved, and I think it's absolutely clear why we had faith in Richard Pettigrew in promoting him so early to be a professor in this university. One of the nice things for me about inaugural lectures is listening to people from different disciplines talking about what those disciplines are. Mine is Russian literature, which seems to me an epitome of bad thinking as I listen to Richard. A whole load of mystical irrationalism that may or may not lead you to the truth at the end of the line. And I'm willing to reject that and believe that we need to think much better than we do in all kinds of ways. The case for good thinking, the importance of good thinking is very clearly made, as are the reflections on the fallacies and wrong-headedness and biases that afflict us in our thinking all the way through just about everything we do. Began by wondering whether what we do as researchers matters and why does it matter. I think Richard has answered that question here just fantastically well. Clearly, what he does matter. And it's not just that we might win the goat instead of the car if we get it wrong. He's got some chastening reflections on what happens and what's happening now as a result of poor thinking, of bad thinking going on in the academy, and of course in the much wider world outside. It's one thing to tear your hair out about that and despair. There's also a question about whether we can change things. Does good thinking matter? Can we change? Can we do things better? Richard, quite clearly, has got solutions. He can make the university a better place and a fairer place than it is. And he does so not just theoretically, in the kind of talk we've heard this evening, but palpably too practically in the tremendous project on the foundation year that he's led and I hope is going to take off and flourish, not just in Bristol, but more widely as we go along. So we can change the future. And thinking and philosophy is really important to that, and philosophers such as Richard, absolutely crucial. And it's really great that he's spoken to us tonight about his work, his aspirations, and I'm sure that he's got a brilliant future ahead of him, many more lectures of this kind. So thank you again for coming. Finally, and as a token of thanks, it may very well be that this lecture is thought-provoking and has prompted many questions. It's a tradition that we don't take questions as inaugural lectures. What we do instead is offer a drink of wine outside. So we'll invite you all to do that now, and Richard will be there, and I'm sure he'll be very pleased to talk more about what he's had to say tonight. So we'll see you outside in a few minutes. Thank you all.